Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Are you ready for recording in the back? Got it. Okay, great. Okay, well, welcome to this session on building inclusive communities and affirmatively furthering fair housing. I'm Marley Hawkendonner. I'm the Executive Director of Northwest Fair Housing Alliance. We're a fair housing organization based in Spokane and serving 17 counties in eastern and central Washington. Our mission is to eliminate housing discrimination through education, advocacy, and training like what we're doing here today. So,
great.
And I'm joined by...
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Chin. My pronouns he, him, and I work at the City of Seattle Office for Civil Rights. And our role in terms of fair housing is to ensure folks are following fair housing laws, and that is what brings us to our conversation today. So we're going to ask for a few questions just to get us started, get us warmed up, get us thinking about affirmatively furthering fair housing. So we'd like to just show of hands, how many of you here are either managed property or portfolio that is federally funded, that receives federal funds for specifically housing? Okay, so about 20%. Okay. How many of you are from city government, state, or housing authorities? Okay, and some of you, you might be raising your hand a couple of times, which is understandable, because I'm kind of narrowing the questions a little bit more or making more expansive. All right, and then how many of you have actually created an equity plan, or your organization have done an analysis of impediments, or affirmatively furthering fair housing plan? Okay, fewer hands. Okay. Well, you are not alone, as you can see, because this stuff that we're going to be talking about has been in the works for many, many years, and it continues to evolve even to today. And so when we talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing, we're going to be talking a lot about different ideas and concepts, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. And so what we're going to be talking to you today is kind of thinking about how to create an equity plan, if you are thinking about developing an equity plan, and thinking about the main components of making it effective, making changes, making it accessible housing, whether it's accessible, but affirmative furthering fair housing. And I want to advance to the next slide. All right. So in this training, we're going to really talk a little bit about kind of building upon what Heidi talked about in the earlier session here, and building upon the fair housing laws. But we're going to kind of go narrow into specifically around individual, structural, and institutional forms of discrimination. A lot of what Heidi provided in the Human Rights Commission was really focused around the types of individual forms of discrimination. We're going to talk also focused around disparate impact rule and disparate effects. And that might be a new term that you should all be aware of, but it's actually the premise, the foundation of these equity plans. We're going to talk about the affirmative furthering fair housing components and some examples and plans and goals and strategies and how to implement this plan. Let me go to the next slide. Oop. All right. Oh, I just want to keep flipping through these things. Is this the right one? Okay. This is the correct one. So in the previous session, we talked about individual forms of discrimination, right? We talked about when someone is being discriminated based on a protected class. We talked about the 7 protected classes that are under the Federal Fair Housing Act, and also additional protected classes under the state law. So individual is when someone is being treated differently because of a protected class. Now we're going to go ahead and step back and look at it from a larger level when we're talking about institution. When we're talking about institutional forms of discrimination, we're looking at policies and practices that may impede on the ability of certain protected classes from being able to get housing. Okay, so from an institution, whether it's housing, whether it's transportation, you're looking at the system of who has benefits and who's burdened from being able to get housing. And then when we look at structural, we're looking at a macro level of how discrimination operates. When we're looking at structure, we're looking at neighborhood segregation And when we talk about neighborhood segregation, we're looking at beyond just housing. We're actually focusing on transportation. We're looking at education. We're looking at healthcare. We're looking at financing. We're looking at a community of how racism perpetuates itself and discrimination. The Fair Housing Act, as many of you may know, passed in 1968. It was one of the most important civil rights acts or laws that were actually adopted in the 1960s. Fair housing was passed a little bit later, 1968. So 1964 was the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, right? Which gave voting laws, and that was Title I, access to education, public places. But it was interesting how housing was one of the last pieces of legislation that passed. And why it's really interesting, it's still a struggle today, is because when we think about neighborhood segregation and who lives in certain neighborhoods and who do not live in neighborhoods, it actually is being played out even today in neighborhoods. When we talk about redlining, those redlinings still exist in many different parts of Washington State and even in Seattle. So what is discriminatory effects? So discriminatory effects is what was discussed in the previous session around discriminatory impact. So discriminatory effects basically means it's a neutral policy or practice that has a discriminatory effect on a protected class. So think about some neutral policies like the ones that are provided below. Use of conviction records in housing, right? There was some guidance from the Department of Justice and HUD around the use of conviction records and how it had a discriminatory impact on race, color, national origin, and people with disabilities, right? Because in this country, we have a disproportionate amount of communities who are impacted based on neutral policies such as you cannot have a criminal record to apply for this housing, right? There's some other examples. Driver's license requirement. This was actually an example of a real life example. In the city of Seattle, about 20 years ago, some of our job descriptions required that we have a driver's license, even though you weren't even driving. So think about my role in the Civil Rights Office. I don't even drive, but yet I would be required to have a driver's license. Who does that impact? People with disabilities. Maybe women, maybe people of different national origins, right? Social Security number for credit verification and citizenship and immigration, which is a new protected class under the state law and as well as in the city of Seattle. So the HUD discriminatory impact effect rule, and let me just give you a little bit more history. And when I talk about history, I'm actually talking about the last 15 years, like 10, 15 years. The US Supreme Court held in 2015, I think 2015, 2016, that under the Federal Fair Housing Act, a neutral policy or practice that has a discriminatory impact based on a protected class is cognizable, or it is a protection under the Federal Fair Housing Act. So in that decision, it basically looked at the HUD policy of discriminatory effect and said, guess what? Housing providers need to look at all of their policies and practices and see whether it has a discriminatory effect. HUD issued a rule in 2013 around this. It was reestablished in 2016. It was removed in 2020 and then reestablished in 2023. So you can see where politics play out in terms of HUD laws and HUD regulations. Well, the discriminatory effect rule basically reinstated the rule from 2015 to 2016, but it really looked at three different areas, and we're going to expand on how these three principles are actually the basis of your equity plan. The first step, it says, housing providers, if you have a neutral policy and practice, you have to evaluate how that policy is being implemented. You have to evaluate who's being impacted. Then you have to analyze who's being brought into housing and who's not. And then you have to explore alternative methods that have a less discriminatory effect on communities of color or on another protected class.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Mike. We're going to go back and forth here a little bit. Next up, we're going to show you a video. It's about 6 minutes, and this is focused on Spokane to highlight some of the systems of discrimination, systemic discrimination that have been in place here or originated, going back to the 1800s and continuing today. So it's about 6 minutes. Our organization, Northwest Fair Housing Alliance, had this produced about 6 years ago, but as there have been so much turnover in organizations, so many people that I encounter now haven't seen it, and so I think it's worth doing again. We would do trainings in our organization, and we can show videos. There's a lot of great videos about discrimination, housing discrimination, the history of the Fair Housing Act, but it didn't really resonate with people here locally. People would say, well, that was somewhere else. That was in Detroit. That was in the South. That's in a big city. That's not our issue. But Spokane has a history of systemic discrimination. And so it's, we can't cover everything in 6 minutes, but we endeavored to, at least give a broad overview. So let's go ahead and play the video. Thanks.
Other than the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot. This is actual language written into a housing covenant. No race or nationality other than the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot. This is actual language written into a housing covenant. You might assume it came from a southern state prior to the Civil Rights era, but it actually came from the Comstock Park neighborhood right here in Spokane. Though no longer legally binding since 1948, some of these covenants remain on real estate deeds today, perhaps in your neighborhood. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, an estimated 89% of Spokane County's population is white, 3% are Asian, Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander, 2% are Black or African American, and 1.8% are American Indian or Alaskan Native. 4% identify as 2 or more races, and 5.7% as Hispanic or Latino. How did this come to be? The history of systemic discrimination in Spokane goes back to the 1800s. As more European American settlers expand west and inhabit the area that became known as Spokane, tension and conflict over land began between the settlers and ancestors of regional tribes. Eventually, federal Indian removal policies violently relocated Spokane's original inhabitants to reservations. Today, Native Americans are less than 2% of Spokane's population. The expansion west also brought the mining, timber, and railroad industries, which began to hire cheap labor from China beginning in the mid-1800s. But with pushback from the local white labor force and the enactment of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, Chinese residency in Spokane dwindled. Japanese immigrants started arriving in the 1890s, also drawn to the labor opportunities of the railroad. But in 1921, Washington State passed the Alien Land Law, barring Asians from owning land. After that, the number of Japanese families in Spokane gradually declined. African Americans began migrating to Spokane in the late 1800s. When the Great Northern Railroad brought Black workers to live in Hilliard, white workers would not let them disembark. But other African American families followed. While genocide, forced displacement, industry, and immigration policy largely dictated who lived in Spokane in the 1800s and early 1900s, by the late 1930s, a new federal policy firmly delineated the racial makeup of Spokane's neighborhoods. The Homeowners Loan Corporation graded neighborhoods into 4 categories based on perceived stability and credit risk. White homogeneous neighborhoods were rated more stable and marked green, while neighborhoods with minority occupants were marked on maps in red and considered high risk for mortgage lenders. This was called redlining. To preserve the ratings of the green category white neighborhoods, restrictive covenants were included in real estate deeds and real estate agents were prohibited from integrating neighborhoods. Although restrictive covenants were outlawed in 1948, throughout the 1950s and 1960s, many African Americans were still unable to purchase property outside red line areas or secure home loans due to real estate association rules and lender refusal to make mortgage loans in Black neighborhoods due to redlining. In 1951, the Spokane Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, and the local chapter of the NAACP protested against local realtor segregation practices. And in the 1950s, prominent African-American Spokane attorney Carl Maxey debated the president of the Washington Association of Realtors 4 times on the issue of housing segregation. In 1968, the Federal Fair Housing Act was passed, making it unlawful to refuse to sell, rent, or negotiate with any person because of a person's inclusion in a protected class of race, color, national origin, or religion. While the Fair Housing Act outlawed housing discrimination, including redlining, steering, and restrictive covenants, residual residential housing patterns and racial disparities from these practices persist, and results of those policies are still evident in residential housing patterns. Here's a map showing where most of the African American population lived in the 1960s. Here's a recent map that shows that the East Central neighborhood of Spokane is still the most non-white populated area of Spokane. Despite Spokane's relatively low population of people of color, there are large concentrations of African Americans and Asians within several apartment complexes and neighborhoods historically identified with people of color. Discrimination across housing, education, employment, and access to credit limit ability to increase intergenerational wealth. African Americans are only 2% of the Spokane population, but are overly represented in federal housing programs, including 8.6% of Section 8 voucher holders and 5% of residents in project housing. And mortgage lending data shows that people of color in Spokane usually have lower home ownership rates and higher mortgage loan denial rates compared to whites. Recipients of federal funds, such as Spokane and Spokane County, are required to affirmatively further fair housing by identifying impediments to fair housing choice in their communities and strategizing to eliminate those barriers. As Spokane's landscape continues to grow, knowing how we got here should help inform our future decision-making. Communities must use a racial justice equity lens when looking at siting, development, funding, and zoning of future housing and housing services.
Okay, thank you. You can go ahead and turn it off. We have this link to our YouTube page for Northwest Fair Housing Alliance. So if you want to see it again, go through the credits, share it with any friends or colleagues, it's on our YouTube. So I think that the phrase that she used there at the end, affirmatively furthering fair housing, is a good segue into that discussion about what is affirmatively furthering fair housing. I'm going to, thank you. Advance our slides. Okay, can we do the slide view? Come in. Okay, thanks. I appreciate someone helping with the technology so that I don't have to do it. Perfect, right there. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so what is affirmatively furthering fair housing? Affirmatively furthering fair housing is taking affirmative steps, proactive, meaningful actions to overcome patterns of segregation, build inclusive communities, and eliminate inequities in housings and our neighborhoods. Okay, where does this come from? Why do we have to do this? And who has to do it? Okay, the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing is included in the Fair Housing Act. HUD is required to administer its programs in and affirmatively further fair housing as it does so. So they pass that obligation on to those they fund, usually cities, counties, states in some instances, housing authorities. Okay, so recipients of federal funds, usually community planning funds like ESG funds, CDBG funds, home funds, all those HUD programs come with a requirement to affirmatively further fair housing. When local jurisdictions sign off on their consolidated plans, on their action plans, they are certifying that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing. And jurisdictions can actually be sued if they don't take steps to overcome the fair housing impediments in their communities. So it comes with strings attached. Some of you may have seen the recent news from Los Angeles, where Los Angeles agreed to settle for, it was a very large sum, like 70 million, for failing to require the affordable housing grantees that they funded to build their housing in compliance with accessibility requirements in the Fair Housing Act. So people who are funded by local jurisdictions, or organizations that are funded by local jurisdictions, have this requirement too, to affirmatively further fair housing. And it expands not just to the programs that are being funded by the home or the ESG funds, but to all the programs. Once the local jurisdiction receives that federal funding, the requirement to affirmatively further fair housing expands to all the services and programs of the local government entity. And it's not just complying with fair housing, okay? So it's one thing to not violate the Fair Housing Act, but to affirmatively further means taking steps to get rid of, to eradicate and overcome the barriers to fair housing. So it requires something more. So that's what we're going to look at. Okay, so HUD has in the past required its recipients of funding, local jurisdictions, to conduct fair housing planning. And what it's required has varied over the years with different federal administrations, different rules coming out. In 2015, there was an affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And then that was rescinded by another administration, and then an interim rule was in place, and currently we have a proposed rule that's been pending since February of 2023. These rules, however, require that jurisdictions do something, okay? You have to do something to affirmatively further fair housing. Sometimes they've called the Fair Housing Plan an analysis of impediments. Then it was an assessment of fair housing, and in the proposed rule, it is called an equity plan. Okay, you can just call it a fair housing plan right now if you want to, but you need the jurisdictions and their grantees need to do something to affirmatively further fair housing, and to do that, to know what you need to do, you need to assess what the barriers are in the community and figure out how to take steps to overcome them, to eradicate them. So the purpose of a fair housing plan is to identify what are the fair housing issues in the community, what are the contributing factors, why are there these fair housing issues, what's causing this, and then set goals and strategies to overcome them. And that's where the affirmatively furthering part comes in. So this is drawn from the pending rule. We don't know what the final rule is going to look like, but it's similar to what the assessment of fair housing was. They're a little bit different. The equity rule, the proposed rule, has more emphasis on community engagement, so that's a little bit different. But both have looked at these systemic areas of transportation, education, that Mike was talking about. So right now, really an assessment of fair housing or an equity plan should include an overview of demographics. Who's in the community? Where are they? Okay. Are there areas of segregation or large concentrations of people based on race or national origin? What are the access to community assets? Are there disparities in that? In access to transportation, to education, to environmentally healthy neighborhoods. Here in Spokane, you can lose 10 years of your life by moving from the South Hill down to the lower areas. The life expectancy is that great of a difference of about a decade. Employment. So all these things, it's a holistic approach, not just looking at housing, okay? And then the equity plan also asks for a focus on what are barriers specific to people with disabilities. That's where you're probably looking at accessibility. Is there accessible housing available? Is it concentrated? Is zoning an impediment? If multifamily housing is only allowed in certain areas, that's where many people with disabilities end up living because of low fixed income. And so then that in turn segregates them. The requirements to provide accessible housing under the Fair Housing Act are only in place, as Heidi said, since 1991. So we have a really old housing stock here. All the old single-family houses aren't going to be very accessible for most people. So again, people are going to be congregated in newer multifamily housing. So those are just some examples of things that you look at. And then is there disparities with people who are residents of publicly funded housing? Again, disproportionalities, like was mentioned in the video. Are there concentrations in certain areas? Is all the affordable housing, all the publicly funded housing being put into one neighborhood? So again, you're essentially creating a segregated neighborhood. Other things to look at: affordable housing opportunities by protected class, housing cost burdens. Who's housing cost burdened? Who's spending more than 30%? Who's severely cost burdened, spending more than 50% of their income on their housing costs? Are there disproportionalities based on race, disability, national origin, other protected classes? How about quality, housing quality? There's data for all this, okay? So looking at your planning, you want to assess your community. What are the patterns? What are the disparities? Home ownership. Who are the homeowners? Is there a disparity in home ownership based on race? Yes, there is. Here in Spokane, there is. Who's getting the mortgage loans? Who's getting denied mortgage loans? Okay, are there any disparities there? So those are the fair housing issues. The contributing factors is digging deeper. Why is this happening? Is it historical stuff like we saw, the redlining? Are there current policies with zoning or something that's bolstering these disparities today? And then finally, a plan looks at the state of current discrimination. So you should look at data from complaints filed with HUD, with the Human Rights Commission, who's coming to organizations like ours, Northwest Fair Housing Alliance, or the Fair Housing Center of Washington over in Tacoma. How many reasonable accommodations are being granted? Testing, we do testing, so we include data like that. Just patterns of discrimination. So, okay, do you want to pick up with this one? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, we have limited time, so if I'm talking too fast, give me like a thumbs down or something.
So what Marley described here is kind of an overview of an equity plan. So we're going to walk you through the 5 steps of things you should think about when you're looking at each of the stages. The first stage is collecting information. Remember when I talked about explore? Collecting information is really, really important. What's the data that you have? What's the data that you don't have? The video also illustrated what the neighborhood looks like at certain times. Community engagement, that is a key difference in this proposed rule. It really leans on your community, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Analyzing the data, that is probably a really big lift. So not just gathering information, input, analyzing what those disparities look like. Who's getting housing, who's not, who's getting loans, who's not, who's getting accessible housing. Then you're going to come up to, with those goals that Marley showed in the previous slides, you're going to start thinking about what are the goals to actually try to mitigate or minimize or eliminate those disparities. Because what you're looking to do is advancing opportunities for communities who may not have opportunities, minimize the harm communities, and to achieve equity. The next step is implementation. How do you implement it? And then the last step is evaluation. Oh, this is my site. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Keep going.
So anyway, so when we talk about community engagement, here are some steps that you should really think about. And a lot of these steps can be transferable to anything that you do. When you're talking about community engagement, whether it's in an equity plan or not, these are some things you should always be thinking about how to do that. Number 1, scope. Scope is really, really important. What is your purpose? So for example, if it's the equity plan, what are you trying to do? You're trying to affirmatively further fair housing, right? How are you going to do that? What steps do you need to do? The next thing is identify stakeholders. Remember when we talked about the importance of community engagement? The identify stakeholders is going to be really important. Who needs to be in the room? Who actually's voice needs to be heard and brought to attention to really focus on communities, especially who have been impacted by racism and discrimination. Defining roles is also another thing. Whose role? Who has the authority to make decisions? Who has the authority to provide feedback? How do you incorporate the recommendations and feedback? Defining roles is going to be really important, because if you're a community member and you're there and they go to, I've been in community meetings where it's like, so what is our role? You're giving us feedback, but what are we supposed to do with that, right? Creating a plan. Once you've actually done that engagement, you want to create a plan of what that looks like in terms of community engagement, and then outreach and communication is the implementation of that. Here are some community engagement 6 essential strategies to think about when you're engaging in communities. And this is actually from the City of Seattle. We have what is called the Race and Social Justice Initiative, and this is a part of our inclusive outreach and public engagement. The first one is build personal relationships. I think one of the things that we hear from communities all the time, especially because we're government, or I work for a city of Seattle, is that we have no relationships in the community. We don't actually have that connection. We only need communities when we are asking or when we have to do this. But building really authentic, important relationships on communities who are most harmed. Creating a welcome atmosphere. I think by creating a welcome atmosphere, we'll bring people in. You want to create a space, especially meetings in community spaces, and thinking about times to make sure that people feel welcome and their input is really important. Increase accessibility. So when Marley was talking about ADA accessibility, we're not just talking about disability accessibility, we're also talking about language accessibility. So for those who may or may not be familiar, that if you receive federal funds, you also have to have what is called a limited English proficiency plan for people who have languages other than English. And in those plans, you may actually have to translate information which is called vital documents into multiple languages. And in Seattle, we have Tier 1 and Tier 2 languages. And so there's a lot of information about how to actually engage in making sure things are accessible, not for just people with disability, but also of national origin. Develop alternative methods for engagement. There's not a one-size-fits-all. You have to approach it in many different ways to reach different communities. Maintaining a presence with the community. I think that's an important thing, is that those relationships and those connections are really going to be important as you develop your plan. And then partner with diverse organizations. You know, I think a lot of times city government and state governments think we're the know-how, right? We know everything. And the reality is we don't. But what we can do is help community voices and community ideas become an actual plan and part of the equity plan, how we want to move forward.
Okay, thanks. So our organization, Northwest Fair Housing Alliance, frequently contracts with local jurisdictions to help them with their fair housing planning. And so in terms of the community engagement, there's several ways that we try and help them do that. But the goal is really to assess the knowledge. Do people know about fair housing rights? Do they know where to file a complaint? And what is their experience with discrimination? Their perception of, is it happening? Has it happened to them? Did they report it? So there's a variety of ways that in doing a fair housing plan, you can try and get that community feedback from surveys, which you can distribute through social media, email campaigns, city websites, so on, focus groups, stakeholder interviews, town halls, public meetings, and then you get into the more formalized process where you usually have to then take it and have it approved by a board, some board for the city or county, and then ultimately approved by the governing body of the jurisdiction. So then there's some public hearing opportunities for people to receive public notice, provide written comment, provide testimony. So it can start from really passive to more formal as you go along. But the equity plan rule, the proposed rule, is saying a minimum of three public meetings should be afforded people. And there was no requirement before in the prior rules, no specific number. Okay, so moving from, we want to get all the information we can, the feedback, the input from the community, but we also need to look at the data, okay, because we need to measure what's been happening in the community. And that data comes from a lot of places. The US Census, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data. There are some great applications online. Policy Map is one. There's a lot of different resources where you can go and you can get data on homeownership, on poverty, on demographics, and over time to make comparisons and determine trends. And looking at this data for housing, education, transportation, jobs, demographics, all of that. Now, these are just some sample slides. I know this is probably really small for those in the back to read, but from one of our more recent projects, we worked with the city of Spokane, and this is just an example of how you can look at demographics and try and pull out trends. There's some columns for the city of Spokane that measures race here from 2000 to 2020. And so a couple of the notable trends that you can pull out is the largest increase in non-white people are people who identify as 2 or more races. So that went from just under 4% in 2000 to almost 10% of the population in 2020. And you can see that people who identify as white alone with no other race went from 89% in 2000 to 79% 20 years later. So we do have some changing demographics here in Spokane. Oops, I jumped. Wow, how did I get really fast there? This is just an example of a map. You can map, again, all kinds of things, home ownership, familial status. This one is mapping where Black and African American people who identify as one race alone are in Spokane at 2.7% of the city, and yet you can drill down to block groups and see where we have 23%, 26%. And so in some cities that might not seem like a lot, but when you have a city like Spokane that has a population of only 2.7%, those are very concentrated areas. And when you start to look, you can see those are some of the areas that were historically redlined, and then that's, some of the contributing factors why we have those persisting patterns. Looking at where people are from. Our largest foreign-born populations in Spokane are people from Mexico and people from Iraq. Okay, I think people from Ukraine and Marshallese, there's been a lot of awareness of that, but I don't hear so many people talking about Iraqi people being here. And so, again, looking at these patterns, you can drill down in mapping, where are they living, where do we need to target, language access materials can be really helpful. Analyzing the data. So we get all this data, again, try and pull out trends based on protected classes. Here's an example. People with disabilities in Spokane have a higher rate. There's a higher rate of people with disabilities in Spokane than there is in the county or the state. And it varies by zip code. So Spokane overall is 16.6%. Washington State is 13%. And yet you can look at different zip codes, 99201 downtown, 99202, and have 25% of the population have people with disabilities there. 99203 is only 12. That's up on the South Hill. So again, does that have to do with where is our multifamily housing? Probably. South Hill being more primarily single-family residents. So just looking for patterns. Publicly supported housing, this was mentioned in the video. If people are overrepresented in the housing choice voucher programs and other publicly supported housing, who's experiencing poverty? Okay, in Spokane, the overall poverty rate, people living in poverty is about 15%, and yet Indigenous people, 36.7%. Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, 29%. Median household incomes, okay? Median household income for everybody would be 100% at $63,000. This was 2022. White people have more than their share at 102%, $64,000. And then there are several groups that are significantly under. Again, Indigenous people, 55%, okay, with a $35,000 annual income. Oops. Okay, renters, you can see who rents by race. Again, BIPOC people are more likely to be renters than homeowners in Spokane. Again, that impacts where you're going to live, what your housing opportunities are. So overall, we're looking for disparities, and there's intersecting market factors with low vacancy rates, rising rents, people living in poverty, people cost burdened, but all these disparities are falling harder on several protected classes, primarily people with disabilities and BIPOC people. Okay, I think this is you, right?
No, this is your.
This is me? Keep going? Oh,
Yep.
Okay. All right, I'll keep going then. So you look at all this data, you get all the community feedback, you try and then identify what are the primary fair housing issues here, and what are the contributing factors, okay? So this is an example. A fair housing issue might be that a certain percent, a high percent of the local population speaks a specific language. Maybe it's Spanish, maybe it's Ukrainian, Dari, Arabic, whatever. What's the contributing factors? Immigration, refugee resettlement trends, maybe where certain refugee resettlement organizations are able to find housing for people, where there's landlords that will take people without a rental history, employment opportunities. Are there established communities that these people are gravitating towards? So what's happening? Why are we seeing certain groups of high language needs in certain areas? So then you might have a goal. We're going to increase language access in housing, and then your strategies. How are we going to do that? We're going to, subscribe to a language line. We're going to translate key documents, employ multi-language multilingual staff, advertise in non-English media, think outside the box, use newspapers and TV and radio that reaches a diverse groups of people, different people than you normally advertise to. Here's another example. Okay, maybe you find that there's a large number of people in the community that request reasonable accommodations that are denied. So that might come from an organization like ours or the one in Tacoma. Insufficient accessible housing. So these are issues affecting people with disabilities. What are contributing factors? Again, we have a higher population of people here that have ambulatory disabilities compared to the county or the state. And then what would be a goal? Increase disability access and housing? How are we going to do that? The strategies are the nitty-gritty. We're going to make sure that entities that receive funding to build housing build it in an accessible manner, or adopt reasonable accommodation policies to respond to reasonable accommodation requests. I'm not sure how we're doing on time here. There's a couple more examples from. Go ahead.
We only have 5 more minutes left? Oh, okay.
I think it goes till 12:10.
12:10. I think it goes to 12:10. You want to ask a question? You have a question? Here. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of this data is great, but it's stuff we've been doing in consolidated plans, if I'm not mistaken, for a long time. Thinking about a lot of us who are on the supply side of affordable housing or building it got really excited about affirmatively furthering. It is such a mouthful. AFFH. We were really stoked because it was like, maybe we can use this as a lever to build in other neighborhoods that have been resisting affordable housing, right? So I guess that's my question for y'all, is how do you see the future of this in terms of us? I mean, I'm going to go with Seattle because I live there, but how can I leverage this to get a nice, affordable project in Magnolia, right? Do we think that we can leverage some of these policies and this research and these plans to expand opportunities? Because I think if we go to low-income communities in neighborhoods that are historically low-income, we need to hear from them. But, they know their neighborhoods. They're going to be like, build some more here. And right now we're kind of overbuilding in some of these communities, in Seattle anyway. Mm-hmm. We need to get people in communities in other places too, so other places can do their fair share.
That's to you, Marley. Sorry.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So where do I start with that? The last part of what you said, I mean, yes, you need to build in opportunity areas, and you need to build in areas that have been disenfranchised and ignored historically. So it's not an either or. You need housing for everybody and housing choice everywhere. These plans definitely can be used to leverage policy. At the end, we come up with goals, strategies, recommendations, and it may get down to zoning, change this zoning, or increase affordable housing here in this neighborhood, if that's what you're hearing back from the community or the trends are showing. Desegregate housing for people, accessible housing from downtown. People want more scattered site housing rather than these big conglomerate things all put together. So what people are hearing, you can put into the recommendations, into the strategies, into the goals, and then the city or the county should take those and implement policies and funding to affect those. So yeah, it can definitely be leveraged, but it depends on what you get and how well the local jurisdiction responds to it. But once it's a policy, the city of Spokane City Council adopted the Fair Housing Plan. So now they have a housing, forget what they call it, a housing subcommittee that's actively reviewing the plan and working on things and going to be making recommendations to city council members. So.
Yeah, and we're happy to talk a little bit, more offline too. But one of the things I think why this has been a moving target. Remember when I first started about this? This has been a moving target. Like every time we think, as the city of Seattle, think we have it, the target, the actual goalpost moves, and then what happens? If we all remember, it becomes unenforced by HUD, because what happened was that HUD said, hey, well, you don't need to submit it, or it's optional. Do you remember that? Remember the analysis of impediments? I was part of that time. We did our caper with City of Seattle, and it was like, oh, we don't have to do it anymore? And guess what? Nobody did it, right? So here's why this is really important. about and why the next steps around implementation and the next steps is around accountability. How do we hold ourselves accountable to developing an equity plan, and who's actually responsible for doing that work? All right? Because I will tell you, in governments across the country, I will probably say, and I will not want to speak badly of my colleagues at the City of Seattle or in other municipalities, but a lot of people don't want to do this work. And a lot of people are afraid to do this work. Because why is it afraid? Because what you're doing in these affirmatively furthering fair housing plans is you're calling out what people don't want to hear. They don't want to hear that there's race disparities, disability, lack of housing for people with disabilities, not providing documentation in languages other than English. And if you look at it from a macro level, from a systemic thing, we're not just talking about housing. Guess where light rail stations are being put in? Let me tell you, there are neighborhoods in Seattle that do not want light rail stations, do not want mass transportation. Why? Because there's this storyline, we talked about story, right, earlier today, the story about, well, then we're going to start having people who are undesirable in our neighborhoods. And that's going to affect our education. That's going to make our parks look bad. That's going to make our public sidewalks look bad. I'm going to have to get more security for my places. I mean, you see how when we peel one peel of the onion about housing, there's actually multiple layers of inequities that actually exist. And what we're talking about, this equity plan, really looking at it from not just a narrow standpoint of home ownership and who's renting and who has vouchers and poverty. When we talk about poverty, there is some intersectionality. And this is why I want to leave this conversation. I know there's a couple of slides here, and I'm really passionate about this, is because this is one of the things I really want to point out why this is so important at this conference, is that this conference has historically focused around what? Affordability. But there's very, very little discussion about the intersectionality of affordability and equity. And what we all seem to believe in that storyline, that master narrative, that if everybody is treated equal, we will get there. I'm here to tell you to think again, because equity will not, treating people equally is not going to eliminate inequities in this world. We actually have to create an equity plan, an equity way of addressing inequities in order to achieve equality. Because that's really what the goal is making sure that everybody has an opportunity. Everybody has opportunities for housing, education, transportation. But we're not quite there yet. And so in the next couple slides here, I want to just kind of come through here, and is around the action steps. In the equity plan, it's so important to be able to tie in what those timelines are and who's responsible. And when people say they're responsible, hold them responsible and accountable to those plans. The next slide is around evaluation. Now, why evaluation is important, and this is also in the proposed rules that have hopefully be finalized, but it's not quite there yet, is there are certain guidelines about how we evaluate whether the equity plan is actually achieving its goals, right? Marley identified a number of different goals sets, and here's how we're going to achieve it, timeline, milestones, responsibility. Now, it's so important to measure outcomes. A lot of times we think about, hey, we want more housing, we want this, but if it's not measurable, it's not a goal. If you can't put a number on number of housing or decrease this or increase this by a certain percentage, if it's not measurable, it's not a goal. The other thing is you need to also provide regular progress updates. I will tell you in the city of Seattle why the CAPER and all these different plans, consolidated plans, didn't work. It's because we submit this plan and then we submit it 5 years later when the next one's due. What happened between second, third, fourth year? Zero. And then we get a letter from HUD saying, guess what? You have to submit your plan again. And then we say, oh, well, we better pull that one out from the last 5 years. Hey, I've been there, and I know exactly what happens in the city and probably other states and municipalities that we don't continuously work on these plans and continuously track and really think about what those results are going to look like. It is so, so important. And I think what's really important too, another takeaway, is that if we don't continue, this is not just a moving target in terms of what the rules are, but if we don't continuously focus our center and around equity, it's not just going to happen overnight. We actually have to continue to work on it and build it into our processes and how we look at different, explore, analyze, and look at how ways that we can really address these inequities in our system. Sorry, go ahead.
Shouldn't that be included in your action plan every year? What you're going to do once you
Yes.
publish this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the best plans are ones you actually have milestones and timelines with an action plan and follow-up. But I will just say that a lot of those plans don't usually build that in, in terms of follow-up and accountability. And now I have both microphones, which is not healthy.
That's okay. Keep going, Mike.
So, any other questions?
Yeah.
So I'm going to be on the side of the developer as well. So we are stuck in an environment where we are given land or we are given a space. And while it is glorious because it's given and not purchased, it becomes a problem because then you are literally placing people in an environment which may not have transportation. We may not have the accessibility that they need, it's not near the things that they need, but it's given to us and we're going to build because we need housing. So it's this double-edged sword. And then I'm also part of the Affordable Housing Advisory Board locally. And that's a conversation about the complexes that are being built by service organizations, but they're all being built in the same location.
Yeah.
So there's this, I see what you're saying, but when you're desperate for the need for housing, it's so hard to not spend a bunch of money in order to find that because it's not affordable.
Yeah.
And so what I'm hearing there is you're reacting, and I'm not you have this opportunity, you have the land, but you're reacting. The more that there can be planning so that we don't end up with housing shortages in the future or people consolidated, segregated in certain communities is what we all want to move forward towards. Yeah. Anybody else? Over here.
And this is just commentary to what was just said. Being from a community that is largely tourist-driven economy, what ends up happening really in what I'm seeing is really kind of an effort to move people out of city centers, out of where the community is thriving and they have access to things, all things including employment, etc. And it forgive the use of the word, but it feels like a form of ghettoization. And it is something that is very difficult and extremely expensive to get out of doing, especially in rural areas that are so, I just attended the Peeling Back NIMBYism class, so I'm hoping to come back with all of this and create some plan forward.
Yeah, it sounds like you just identified a major fair housing issue,
Yeah.
displacement of communities in historic neighborhoods. So
Yeah.
whether it's the light rail, the freeway system, tourism areas, fair housing issue for sure. And why is that happening? And then what are the goals and strategies we're going to do to stop it? Okay, are we getting time there? Or a question back there?
I have a question, but I think we're also, are we at the end yet? Yeah, maybe this is the last question.
Okay, I think last question. Oh, you have a mic.
I think I constantly struggle with yes, there's these opportunities, so you want to take advantage. Oh, we don't have housing, we need housing. But it's like, where are we going and what are we doing? And we have to balance that too. Because last year at this conference, there was a session and it was like patting themselves on the back about some campus in East Bellevue. And the very next thing was lunch, and it was like, all about redlining. And I'm like, we're still doing that. Like,
Yeah.
we're doing that. So how can we move past that in a way where it's like, maybe we have to turn down some opportunities here because of the long run and the bigger picture of what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
And I call it warehousing. The ghettoizing, I call it warehousing people. We're basically just shoving them into these buildings and these places.
Well, that's probably an apt comment to end on. So thank you all so much for attending the session. Thank you for having us.